Onyx lunged forward with a force that nearly tore the reins from Caleb's hands. His hooves struck the ground with a rhythm that sounded like thunder, his dark eyes locked on something invisible to everyone but him. "Onyx, stop!" Caleb's voice was sharp, his breath catching as he dug his heels into the soft ground. But the horse's strength was overwhelming, and before Caleb could plant his footing, Onyx surged ahead, yanking the reins clean out of his grip. With a panicked lunge, Caleb threw himself forward and caught hold of the reins again, but it was a mistake. Onyx was already charging, his powerful strides relentless. Caleb found himself being dragged along the damp earth, his boots skidding uselessly behind the horse. "Onyx! Damn it! Stop!" Caleb shouted, his voice strained. Pain shot through his arm as the reins bit into his palms, but he refused to let go. The horse didn't slow. Caleb was pulled off his feet entirely, his knees scraping the ground. He tried to dig in his heels again, but the muddy ground betrayed him. The world became a blur of darkness and motion as Caleb gritted his teeth against the searing pain in his arms and legs. "All right, you stubborn beast," Caleb growled, half in desperation, half in frustration. Gathering his strength, he swung his leg over Onyx's side and hauled himself up onto the saddle, his body protesting every movement. It wasn't graceful. Caleb nearly lost his grip again as Onyx bucked slightly, the horse's single-minded determination unbroken. But he managed to settle onto the saddle, leaning forward to clutch at the reins. "You listen to me!" Caleb yelled, yanking on the reins with all the strength he could muster. "You're going to stop right now, or so help me!" But Onyx didn't listen. His ears flicked back briefly, acknowledging Caleb's presence, but his focus remained on whatever unseen force drove him forward. Caleb cursed under his breath, his hands trembling as he tried to pull the reins harder. "Fine! Have it your way!" Caleb spat, throwing up his hands in frustration. He clung tightly to the saddle as Onyx charged onward, the horse's every muscle straining with a purpose Caleb couldn't yet understand. "Lead me wherever you're going, then," Caleb muttered through clenched teeth. His heart pounded as he gripped the saddle horn, bracing himself for whatever came next. Everything started the morning before, when the gentle sunlight filtered through the rows of trees surrounding the ranch. Onyx stood there, near the fence as usual, his sharp eyes fixed on the sky above. Caleb was carrying a bucket of water when he noticed that Onyx wasn't just idly staring. There was something deliberate in his gaze, almost as if the horse was analyzing something invisible to everyone else. "You're doing it again, Onyx," Caleb muttered, setting the bucket down. He walked toward the horse, his weathered hand running along Onyx's sleek neck. But instead of relaxing under the familiar touch, Onyx remained rigid, his ears twitching, catching every faint noise. In the distance, the low hum of an airplane engine drifted closer, then faded as the plane disappeared into the horizon. Caleb squinted in the same direction, following Onyx's unwavering gaze. For months, Caleb had been puzzled by Onyx's strange behavior. It wasn't like the other horses who went about their routines without a care. Onyx always reacted, sometimes subtly, other times violently, to the sounds of airplanes passing overhead. Caleb had mentioned it to the ranch owner before, but was met with nothing but a dismissive wave of the hand. "He's just a sensitive horse," the owner had said with a smirk. "You spend too much time with him, Caleb. You're imagining things." Caleb didn't argue. Still, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that Onyx wasn't just a sensitive horse. Something about him was different, special. Later that morning, Caleb was grooming Onyx when the familiar roar of an engine reached their ears. Instantly, Onyx stiffened, his nostrils flared, and he let out a sharp, piercing neigh that startled Caleb so much he nearly dropped the brush in his hand. "Whoa! Whoa! Easy, boy!" Caleb said quickly, grabbing the reins to steady him. Onyx didn't calm down. Instead, he yanked his head violently, pulling against Caleb's firm grip. "What's gotten into you now?" Caleb muttered, glancing toward the direction of the sound. A plane was taking off in the distance, but to Caleb, it looked and sounded like any other day. Onyx stomped the ground with enough force to kick up small clouds of dust, his eyes blazing with a determination that made Caleb uneasy. "You're acting like you've seen a ghost," Caleb muttered under his breath, shaking his head as he tightened his grip on the reins. That night, the stillness of the ranch was broken. The air was quiet except for the hum of crickets in the fields, but Onyx was anything but calm. He stood near the fence, his posture tense, his head raised high as though he were a sentinel watching over the land. The distant rumble of an airplane engine finally broke the silence, and the moment it did, Onyx erupted. The horse neighed loudly, his voice cutting through the night like a warning bell. Caleb stumbled out of the house, hastily throwing on his coat as he ran toward the commotion. "Onyx, what's gotten into you this time?" Caleb called, but his voice faltered when he saw the horse's state. Onyx was pulling at the reins with a strength that Caleb had never seen before. His hooves pounded the ground as if trying to shake off the constraints holding him back. "Whoa! Calm down, boy!" Caleb shouted, grabbing hold of the reins with both hands. But Onyx wasn't calming down. If anything, his resolve seemed to harden. Before Caleb could think of what to do, Onyx yanked the reins so hard that Caleb was thrown off balance. The horse bolted, dragging Caleb along the damp ground. "Stop! Onyx! Stop!" Caleb shouted, his voice tinged with panic. The reins burned against his hands, and every muscle in his body screamed in protest as he clung on for dear life. The world blurred around him as Onyx's relentless charge pulled him through grass, dirt, and stones. "You damn stubborn beast!" Caleb growled, his teeth gritting against the pain shooting up his arms. His knees scraped against the earth, and his boots failed to find any grip on the slippery ground. Desperate, Caleb made a split-second decision. Summoning every ounce of strength, he swung his leg over the horse's side and scrambled onto the saddle. His body ached as he adjusted his weight, his breath coming in shallow gasps. All right, you win," Caleb said through clenched teeth, pulling at the reins in a futile attempt to slow Onyx. The horse ignored him, his powerful strides unrelenting. Caleb let out a frustrated groan and leaned forward, gripping the saddle horn tightly. "You'd better be leading me somewhere important," Caleb muttered, his voice shaky with both anger and fear. Onyx galloped on, his focus sharper than ever, his body moving with a determination that Caleb had never seen before. Whatever was driving the horse forward, Caleb could feel it too now. A pull, an urgency that demanded they press on. "All right, boy," Caleb said softly, his grip steadying as he adjusted to the rhythm of Onyx's stride. "Let's see where this takes us." Onyx thundered through the dark, his hooves striking the earth in a relentless rhythm. Caleb clung tightly to the saddle, every muscle in his body tensed as the wind whipped past him. The horse wasn't slowing, his focus locked on some unseen destination ahead. The silhouette of the airport's hangars loomed closer, their shapes faintly visible under the pale glow of security lights. Onyx veered slightly, his path narrowing toward a smaller, isolated hangar at the edge of the property. As they approached, Caleb's heart thudded against his ribs. Something wasn't right. Shadows flickered near the plane parked just outside the hangar. Caleb squinted, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. There were 3 figures moving around the plane. They worked quickly, their movements sharp and deliberate. One crouched low by the landing gear, fiddling with something Caleb couldn't make out, while the other two stood watch, scanning the area with nervous energy. "What the hell is this?" Caleb whispered under his breath. Before he could process what he was seeing, Onyx let out a piercing neigh that shattered the quiet night. The sound ricocheted across the open space, freezing the men in their tracks. "Damn it, Onyx!" Caleb hissed, yanking at the reins in a futile attempt to rein him in. But the horse was already surging forward, his powerful strides aimed directly at the group of saboteurs. "Who's there?" one of the men barked, his voice laced with panic. Onyx didn't stop. His dark form barreled toward them, his eyes blazing with an intensity that sent the men scrambling. The man crouched near the plane dropped his tool, the metallic clang echoing ominously. "Run!" one of them shouted, shoving the other as they bolted toward the shadows. Caleb gritted his teeth, his hands tight on the reins as Onyx came to a sudden halt, his hooves skidding against the asphalt. The horse stood tall, his chest heaving as he let out another sharp neigh. His body was positioned squarely between the plane and the direction the men had fled, like a sentinel standing guard. "Onyx, easy boy," Caleb said, his voice low and steady as he slid off the saddle. His boots hit the ground with a thud, his legs trembling from the adrenaline coursing through him. As Caleb approached the plane, his stomach churned. The tool left behind by the saboteurs glinted under the hangar lights, and something near the landing gear caught his eye. He crouched closer, his hands trembling as he reached out. It was a small device, barely visible against the dark metal of the landing gear. Wires snaked from its casing, coiling tightly around the mechanisms. Caleb didn't need to be an expert to know it didn't belong there. "Good Lord," he muttered, backing away slowly. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers clumsy with panic, as he dialed the airport security. "There's a problem at Hangar 7, he said quickly when the call connected. "I don't know what it is, but you need to send someone out here. Now." Onyx remained in place, his posture rigid and his gaze fixed on the distant shadows where the men had disappeared. Caleb placed a hand on the horse's neck, feeling the tension in his powerful muscles. "You knew," Caleb murmured, a mixture of awe and disbelief in his voice. "You always know." Thaish. Within minutes, the hum of engines broke the silence as airport security vehicles sped toward the hangar. Flashlights cut through the darkness, their beams darting across the plane and the surrounding area. "What's going on here?" one of the security officers demanded, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. Caleb stepped forward, his voice steady, despite the fear still coursing through him. "There's something on the landing gear, looks like a bomb or sabotage. I don't know exactly, but it's not supposed to be there." The officers moved swiftly, cordoning off the area and radioing for a bomb squad. Caleb watched as technicians carefully examined the device, their faces grim. "It's a timed explosive," one of them confirmed, his voice cutting through the tense air. "This could have gone off during takeoff." Caleb felt his knees go weak, but he steadied himself by gripping Onyx's reins. The horse stood unmoving, his gaze unwavering as if he were still keeping watch. Amid the chaos, a tall man in a tailored suit approached the scene. His presence was commanding, his sharp features illuminated by the glow of the security lights. Caleb recognized him immediately. Graham Kensington, a businessman whose name was synonymous with power and influence. His eyes, accustomed to scrutinizing contracts and closing high-stakes deals, now studied the horse with a mix of awe and curiosity. "Someone tell me what's going on here," Graham commanded, his firm voice slicing through the tension in the air. Before anyone could respond, a security officer gestured toward the hangar. "Mr. Kensington, it appears these men were tampering with the plane." Graham's gaze shifted from the hangar to the masked men, now restrained by the guards. "Tampering?" he asked, his tone sharp. "With my plane?" His voice carried a weight of authority that made even the wind seem to hesitate. He strode forward, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete as he approached one of the men. "You've got 5 seconds to tell me what you were doing. If you lie," he added, leaning slightly closer, "I'll know." The masked man said nothing, but his eyes betrayed him. He was visibly nervous, like a cornered rat. Graham turned to the security team, his instincts telling him there was more to this than met the eye. "I had a feeling something wasn't right," he muttered, his voice a blend of confusion and admiration. Before Graham could press further, another security guard came rushing out of the hangar, his face pale. "Sir, we found something," the guard announced breathlessly. "The landing gear has been sabotaged. If the plane had taken off, it would have been a disaster." The words hung heavy in the air, hitting everyone like a physical blow. Passengers, who had been moving about carefree minutes earlier, now stood frozen, processing the chilling revelation. Graham turned slowly toward Onyx, his piercing gaze fixed on the horse. "You knew, didn't you?" he murmured, almost to himself. Onyx let out a low whinny, as if in confirmation. Graham shook his head, still grappling with the enormity of what had just happened. "This horse," Graham said finally, his voice heavy with gratitude, "saved our lives." He looked over at Caleb, his expression softening. "And you thought he was just a regular horse?" As the tension in the hangar began to lift, one thing was clear to everyone. Onyx was no ordinary animal. He was something much more. A guardian, a savior, and in that moment, a hero. Minutes ticked by, the air still electric with the aftermath of what had nearly occurred. Graham, now standing close to Onyx, ran a hand along the horse's strong neck, as though trying to unravel the mystery of what made him so extraordinary. Before he could say a word, Onyx stepped forward, raising his head high. The horse released a deep, resonant neigh that echoed through the hangar like thunder. Every head turned toward him, drawn by the commanding sound. It wasn't just a whinny, it was a warning, a message no one could ignore. Graham furrowed his brow, his sharp eyes scanning the hangar. Then he noticed something. "Where's the other one?" he asked, gesturing toward the hangar. The guards exchanged confused glances. Finally, one of them replied, "The other masked man, he's gone." Onyx suddenly bolted toward the opposite side of the hangar, where a row of crates was stacked haphazardly. The sound of something moving stealthily echoed from that direction. Onyx stopped abruptly, his head tilted as he whinnied again, his body taut like a predator, ready to strike. "Over there!" Graham barked, pointing toward the crates. The guards sprang into action, fanning out to surround the area. A loud clatter of metal falling to the ground made everyone jump. Behind the crates, the second masked man attempted to flee, but was intercepted after just a few steps. "Let me go! You don't understand!" he shouted, struggling against the guard's grip. Graham approached, his expression unyielding. "What were you doing?" he demanded. "Speak!" The man hesitated, but as Graham stepped closer, his piercing stare broke the man's resolve completely. "There were explosives in the cargo hold," the man confessed, his voice shaking. We wanted to cause an accident, but it didn't work." Silence fell over the group like a lead weight. Explosives? This wasn't just sabotage, it was a calculated act of destruction. Graham closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself against the rising anger threatening to overtake him. When he opened them, his gaze fell on Onyx, who stood steadfast, watching as though waiting for the next threat to emerge. If it weren't for him, Graham said, his voice heavy with emotion. "We'd all be dead right now." Caleb, standing beside him, nodded silently as he stroked Onyx's neck. Onyx, ever composed, didn't move. It was as if he already knew his mission here was complete. The wind picked up, carrying the sharp scent of jet fuel and churned earth. The silence of the airport had been broken by the chaotic sounds of urgent voices and hurried footsteps as security personnel swarmed the area. Onyx, standing tall in the center of the commotion, slowly turned his head, his ears twitching as if catching something no one else could hear. Caleb held the frayed reins with trembling hands, his own nerves frayed from the night's events. But Onyx remained alert, his restless energy suggesting that his work might not yet be done. The horse lunged forward, his muscles rippling with a power that seemed impossible to contain. "Easy, boy, it's all over now," Caleb murmured, trying to steady him. But Onyx knew it wasn't over. He felt it in his bones. Without warning, the horse jerked hard, pulling at the reins with such force that the old leather snapped like dry paper. Caleb stumbled backward, landing hard on the ground. "Onyx!" he shouted, watching helplessly as the horse charged toward one of the farthest hangars. The scene felt surreal, almost like something out of a dream. Graham's calm but commanding voice broke through the moment. "Let him go," he said, his words laced with a quiet confidence that no one questioned. Onyx galloped with a purpose, as though guided by an unseen force. His pace never faltered, his movements as deliberate as they were urgent. As he approached the hangar, he skidded to an abrupt stop, his hooves scraping against the concrete. The horse reared back, letting out a sharp, resounding neigh that seemed to cut through the thick night air. Graham and the security team followed at a cautious distance, their steps hesitant. Caleb, his heart pounding, ran as fast as his legs would carry him, but he was too far behind to catch up. By the time they all arrived, the sight before them seemed to freeze time itself. Tucked in the corner of the hangar, partially obscured behind a stack of crates, was a black duffel bag. Graham stepped forward, his face tightening as he took in the ominous sight. "More explosives," he muttered, disbelief etched in his voice. He turned sharply to the security team. "Call the bomb squad, now!" Onyx stood firm, almost statuesque, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Yet he didn't move. His dark eyes stayed locked on the bag as though he knew exactly what was inside. Graham glanced at the horse and something shifted within him. It wasn't just admiration or shock. It was a connection, an unspoken understanding that ran deeper than words. "This horse," Graham began, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "He's not just a hero, he's a savior." As the bomb squad arrived to safely dismantle the device, Onyx finally relaxed, lowering his head slightly. His eyes found Caleb, who had just reached him, breathless and wide-eyed. Caleb dropped to one knee, cupping the horse's face in his hands. "What are you, boy?" Caleb asked, his voice trembling with a mix of awe and exhaustion. "An angel in disguise." He managed a shaky smile, his eyes glistening with unspoken gratitude. Graham observed quietly, his arms crossed over his chest, his stance resolute, as if he were facing the very fragility of fate itself. Beside him, Onyx stood tall and unyielding, a guardian who would not rest until he was sure the danger had passed. "Mr. Graham," one of the bomb technicians called out, his voice breaking the tense silence. "The device has been disarmed." Graham let out a slow, measured breath, but before he could allow himself to relax, a low, grinding noise echoed from the other side of the hangar. An engine. Graham spun around, his sharp eyes narrowing as a white van burst through a side door, its tires screeching against the concrete. The rear doors flapped wildly as the van sped off, a plume of dust trailing in its wake. "They're trying to get away," someone shouted, and chaos erupted once more. Security officers scrambled toward nearby vehicles, their shouts overlapping in the rush to pursue the fleeing van. But Onyx didn't wait for instructions. In an instant, the horse bolted, his hooves pounding the ground like rolling thunder. Caleb called after him, his voice lost in the commotion, but Onyx was already far beyond anyone's reach. His speed was astonishing, each stride a burst of controlled power that quickly ate up the distance between him and the van. Inside the vehicle, the two masked men were yelling at each other, their panic palpable. "Step on it," one of them barked, his voice cracking with fear. "It's just a horse." But when they glanced in the rearview mirror, their confidence evaporated. Onyx's eyes glinted in the dim light, fierce and unyielding, like a predator locked onto its prey. The horse surged forward, darting to the side of the van. With a force that defied explanation, he rammed into the vehicle, sending crates tumbling out of the open doors. The driver lost control for a moment, the van swerving off the road and skidding to a halt in the damp grass nearby. It was all the time the security team needed. Within moments, they surrounded the immobilized van, pulling the men from the vehicle and securing them in handcuffs. Onyx stood nearby, his breathing heavy but steady. His eyes remained fixed on the men as though ensuring they posed no further threat. Graham arrived shortly after, stepping out of his car with an expression that was equal parts disbelief and gratitude. He approached Onyx slowly, shaking his head. "You've done it again," Graham said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of emotion. Onyx tilted his head slightly, almost as if acknowledging the words. Graham let out a soft chuckle, running a hand down the horse's neck. "You're not just a hero, Onyx. You're something else entirely. Something I'll never fully understand, but will always respect." As the men were escorted away in custody, those who had gathered couldn't take their eyes off Onyx. To them, he wasn't just a horse anymore. He was a legend, a living embodiment of courage and instinct that defied comprehension. And as the hangar quieted once more, the weight of what had just transpired lingered in the air, a reminder of the extraordinary animal standing at its center. The passengers, who had been walking casually toward the plane minutes earlier, now stood huddled together in one corner, murmuring anxiously. The tension in the air was almost tangible. Some stared at the security guards questioning the masked men, while others glanced toward the tarmac, where Onyx stood steadfast like a sentinel. A middle-aged woman in a tailored suit, clutching a leather carry-on, approached Graham with visible agitation. "Mr. Kensington, what's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of confusion and fear. "Are we safe? That horse—" Her words faltered as she gestured toward Onyx. Graham raised his hand in a calming gesture. "Everything is under control, Mrs. Margot," he said, his voice steady, yet carrying a quiet reverence. "What happened was prevented. Because of him." He motioned toward Onyx. His tone, firm yet imbued with respect, quieted the murmurs of the group. "That horse saved all of us." A young man with tousled hair stepped forward, his arms crossed skeptically. "A horse? How is that even possible? How could he know something was wrong?" Caleb, who had been silently standing off to the side, stepped forward. "He's always been different," he exclaimed, his voice tinged with pride and raw emotion. "Since the day he was born, Onyx has sensed things none of us could understand. Today, he proved his curiosity is something greater." The murmurs swelled, some passengers remaining doubtful while others began to regard Onyx with a mix of admiration and awe. A little girl, clutching her father's hand, spoke up softly, her words cutting through the noise. "He's like a hero from the movies, Dad. But real." Graham smiled at her comment and turned to face the group. "She's right," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "You might find it hard to believe what you've seen today, but I can promise you one thing. If it weren't for him, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now." As Graham spoke, Onyx turned to face the crowd. His gaze was calm but penetrating, almost as if he fully grasped the weight of his actions. The crowd fell silent. For a fleeting moment, it felt as though everyone was connected by an unspoken emotion, something that transcended fear and disbelief. Gratitude began to replace confusion. Onyx hadn't just saved lives, he'd given these people a story they would carry forever. As the passengers gradually calmed, Graham Kensington stood quietly, taking in the scene around him. A man accustomed to handling the unexpected, corporate crises, high-stakes negotiations and decisions involving millions, Graham now found himself feeling something unfamiliar: profound humility. Under the grey sky of the airport, he took a step toward Onyx, who still stood motionless, as if awaiting a final command. Graham, known for his commanding presence, the kind that made people sit straighter when he entered a room, seemed smaller in that moment, almost insignificant before the horse's quiet power. "You have more courage than most men I've ever met," Graham said softly, his words nearly lost to the breeze. He wasn't speaking to impress anyone. He said it because he meant it. There was something about Onyx that defied explanation, a presence, an intelligence that went beyond mere animal instinct. Caleb stepped closer, his voice trembling with a mix of respect and nerves. Onyx has always been like this. He senses things, like he knows what's going to happen before anyone else does. Today, he proved it. Graham studied Caleb for a moment, then nodded. "You've taken good care of him," he said firmly, his tone tinged with admiration. But as he turned back to Onyx, Graham's expression shifted to something resolute. "But he doesn't belong here anymore. Not after today." His words lingered in the air, and Caleb's eyes widened in shock. "What are you saying, sir?" Caleb asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. Graham took another step closer to Onyx, extending his hand slowly. The horse allowed the touch, bowing his head slightly, as if understanding the gesture. "I'm saying he deserves more," Graham replied. "A place where his strength and intelligence can be recognized for what they truly are." Graham turned back to Caleb, his dark eyes unwavering. "I want to take him with me." Caleb blinked, his confusion evident. "But, sir, Onyx has lived here his whole life. This is his home." Graham straightened, his gaze never wavering. "And do you really think this place is enough for him? Onyx isn't just a stable horse anymore. He saved lives today, and I believe he can do much more." The weight of Graham's words hung between them. Caleb looked down, clutching his hat tightly. "I know it's hard," Graham said, his tone softening, "but I promise you this. He'll be treated with the respect he deserves. He won't just be a hero. He'll be an inspiration." Caleb remained silent for a long moment, the brim of his hat trembling in his hands. Finally, he sighed and lifted his head to meet Graham's gaze. "If it's for his good, then I accept," Caleb said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "But take care of him like he's your own blood." Graham nodded solemnly, his expression reflecting the weight of the responsibility he was taking on. He placed a firm hand on Caleb's shoulder. "You have my word." As the sky lightened with the first hints of dawn, Onyx stood between the two men like a bridge, linking courage, humanity, and something even deeper, something neither could fully put into words. As the sun's early rays painted the horizon, the airport began to settle back into its routine. The sabotage equipment had been removed, the culprits were in custody, and the once bustling hangar had fallen into an eerie stillness. Yet Graham Kensington's task wasn't finished. He approached the bomb squad experts gathered near the defused device, their faces still tense, as if they bore the lingering weight of the disaster that had been averted. Graham, exuding his usual air of authority, leaned in to examine the contents of the bag closely. Placed to detonate at altitude, one of the specialists explained. This wasn't just about causing a crash on takeoff. It was designed to ensure complete destruction mid-air. The words turned Graham's stomach. Though he stood perfectly still, his mind raced to process the implications. "Who was on that plane?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the now exposed device. One of the officials hesitated, glancing sideways before replying. "A high-ranking government official, a state senator to be precise, a prominent figure." He locked eyes with Graham. This wasn't an accident. It was a calculated assassination attempt. Graham straightened, his jaw tightening as the weight of the revelation settled in. This was no isolated incident. It was part of something far more sinister, something that could ripple far beyond the immediate danger, threatening not just lives, but political stability. And at the center of it all stood the one who had saved them from devastation, a horse who seemed to perceive threats beyond human comprehension. Graham's gaze drifted to Onyx, who was surrounded by passengers still marveling at his presence. The horse stood stoically, seemingly unaffected by the chaos around him, but Graham knew better. There was something extraordinary about Onyx, an intuition, a sensitivity that went far beyond animal instinct. "Logan?" Graham called, his tone sharp, his eyes never leaving Onyx. "I want this investigated to the end. Who ordered this? What was their motive? I want answers." "Yes, sir," Logan replied without hesitation, already preparing to act. Graham exhaled deeply, shifting his attention back to Onyx. He walked toward the horse, his footsteps echoing across the concrete floor. When he reached him, he placed a gentle hand on Onyx's muscular neck, feeling the vibrant life coursing through him. "You didn't just save lives, Onyx," Graham said softly, his voice barely audible. "You changed the course of something far greater. And now you're part of something no one will ever forget." Onyx let out a low whinny, bowing his head slightly as if he understood the words. Graham knew that the lives of everyone there, including his own, had been irrevocably changed. In that moment, the Black Stallion wasn't just a hero. He was a beacon of hope amid the chaos. As the sun climbed higher, the bag containing the defused device was removed from the hangar. Word of the thwarted attack began spreading among the passengers and airport staff. Each face reflected a mix of relief and shock, as if they were waking from a nightmare they hadn't realized they were living. At the center of it all stood Onyx, calm and majestic, observing the commotion around him. Those who had once seen him as just another horse now gazed at him with reverence. Some approached cautiously, while others hung back, unable to take their eyes off the animal who had somehow prevented a tragedy. A man in his 40s, holding his coffee cup tightly, murmured to no one in particular, "A horse saving lives. That's the kind of thing you hear about in legends, not real life." And yet, here he is. Nearby, Caleb stood close to Onyx, his arms crossed, letting out a deep sigh. "He's always been different," Caleb admitted, his voice a blend of pride and disbelief. "Always curious, always alert. But I never imagined he'd do something like this, something so extraordinary." Graham, standing beside Caleb, listened in silence. Despite all his years of logical decision-making, of mastering the art of rational thought, he couldn't explain what had happened. He glanced from Onyx to the passengers, who were still whispering amongst themselves, crafting their own theories about the day's events. Then, a young woman clutching her phone stepped forward, her excitement breaking the growing quiet. "I recorded everything," she announced, her voice trembling with emotion. The moment he ran, how he faced everything. People need to see this. They need to know what happened here today. Graham studied her carefully, his expression measured and thoughtful. "The world needs stories like this," he said, his tone resolute. "Something to inspire, something to remind people that even in the darkest times, light can come from the most unexpected places." The woman smiled, her tension easing as Graham turned his attention back to Onyx. Moving closer to the horse, he spoke in a low, almost confessional tone. "You've taught us a lesson no man ever could. Something none of us will forget anytime soon." Onyx let out a soft whinny, a sound that carried a calm energy, almost as if he understood every word. And in that moment of relief and awe, everyone present realized that this was far from the end of the story. It was merely the beginning of something much greater. The atmosphere at the airport had shifted completely. What had once been a place filled with tension and fear now buzzed with hushed conversations and admiring glances. The tale of Onyx spread quickly among passengers, airport staff, and even the police who had arrived to investigate the incident. Standing beside the stallion, Graham found himself surrounded by a spontaneous crowd. Normally, a man who preferred calculated speeches, he felt the weight of the moment pressing for something genuine and unplanned. Raising his hand for silence, he waited as the murmurs died down. "Today," he began, his voice clear and steady, "we witnessed something extraordinary. This horse, Onyx, has shown us that courage and instinct have no boundaries. He saw danger where none of us did, and he acted when many of us might not have." The crowd stood in captivated silence, hanging on Graham's every word. Some edged closer, forming a semicircle around Onyx, who stood still but alert, his dark eyes catching the light like polished obsidian. "Today," Graham continued, "we are not just grateful for witnessing an act of heroism. Onyx is not just a horse. He is a symbol, a reminder that even in our darkest moments, there are forces that guide us, sometimes from where we least expect." For a moment, the silence that followed was absolute. Then, a single clap broke the stillness, quickly followed by more until the applause swelled into a thunderous ovation. Some cheered, others wiped away tears, but all were united in awe. Caleb, standing to the side, discreetly dabbed at his eyes with the back of his hand. He had always known Onyx was special, but he never imagined the world would see it too. As the applause continued, Graham leaned slightly toward Caleb and spoke in a quieter voice. "He deserves more than just words. I want the world to know what he did today. I want his story to inspire people." Caleb nodded, clutching his hat against his chest. "He's always been extraordinary, sir. He just needed someone to see it." Graham smiled faintly, resting a hand gently on Onyx's neck. "I see it now, and I'll make sure the world sees it too." Under the warmth of the sun and the weight of countless admiring eyes, Onyx became more than just a hero of the hour. He became a hero for all time, and everyone knew this was only the start of his story. The applause lingered in the air as Graham turned back to Caleb, his expression softer than it had been all day. He had seen much in his life, multi-million-dollar deals, high-stakes negotiations, challenges that tested every fiber of his being. but nothing compared to what he had witnessed that day. Onyx wasn't just a horse. He was something beyond logic or comprehension. "Caleb," Graham began, his voice steady yet heavy with meaning, "I've made a decision. I hope you'll hear me out." Caleb looked at him, a mix of curiosity and unease in his expression. "Go ahead, Mr. Kensington." Graham drew a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I want to take Onyx to my property. He deserves more than this place can offer. He deserves a home where his courage and intelligence can be truly appreciated, a place where he can live as the hero he is." The words hit Caleb like a gust of wind. Deep down, he had always known this moment would come. Onyx had always been special. But now, after everything that had happened, he was no longer just the horse Caleb knew and loved. He was something far greater. Accepting that, however, was harder than Caleb had anticipated. "Sir, I understand what you're saying," Caleb replied, his voice wavering as he fought to contain his emotions. "But Onyx has lived his whole life here. He knows every corner of this place, and more importantly, he's part of my life. How can I just let him go?" Graham nodded slowly, as if he had already anticipated the reaction. "I'm not saying it will be easy, Caleb, and I'm not asking you to let him go. I want you to come with him. I want you to keep caring for him, but in a place where he'll have everything he needs and more. A place where he'll be protected, admired, and above all, respected." Caleb stood silently, absorbing those words. Onyx stood calmly beside them, as if he somehow knew they were talking about him. His intense eyes seemed to radiate a quiet understanding that helped Caleb make the decision he knew in his heart was right. "If it's for his own good, then I'll accept it," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you must understand, sir, Onyx isn't just a horse. He's part of something much bigger. Taking care of him means knowing that." Graham nodded with a small, understanding smile. "I know that now, Caleb. He's not just a horse, he's an inspiration, and I'll do whatever it takes to honor that." A day that had started as ordinary on the ranch had transformed into the beginning of a new chapter for Onyx. A chapter that would take him into a world where his greatness would finally be recognized. And while Caleb's heart felt heavy, he knew this was what was best for the horse who had always been so much more than ordinary. The main gates of Graham Kensington's estate creaked open, revealing a picturesque scene that looked like something out of a dream. Rolling green fields stretched out endlessly, bordered by tall, stately trees. In the distance, an elegant main house with large windows and sweeping porches seemed to embrace the horizon. Onyx, his head held high, watched with curiosity as the truck made its way down the gravel road. Caleb sat in the passenger seat beside Graham, unable to hide his unease. "He's never been to a place like this," Caleb murmured, glancing at Onyx through the side mirror. "I hope he can adjust." Graham smiled, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "If there's one thing I've learned about Onyx, it's that he's no ordinary horse. He has a curious soul, Caleb. He'll find his place here, and when he does, you'll see something even greater." The truck rolled to a stop in front of a large, well-maintained stable. The air was filled with the fresh scent of hay and wood shavings. Workers in spotless uniforms stood at the ready, waiting to assist. But as Onyx stepped off the truck, no one approached him immediately. They simply watched, their demeanor respectful, almost reverent. Onyx walked slowly, his hooves crunching on the gravel as if he were taking in every detail, the scents of the grass, the faint sounds of distant animals. Caleb climbed down after him, holding the reins loosely but without exerting any pressure. "Go on, boy," he said softly, his voice tinged with emotion. "This is your new home." Graham stepped forward, crossing his arms as he observed the horse explore his surroundings. "They say animals can sense the energy of a place," Graham remarked, glancing at Caleb, "and it looks like Onyx approves." Caleb chuckled quietly, though there was a tear glistening at the corner of his eye. "He deserves this, all of it." As Onyx approached the stable, something remarkable happened. The other horses, who had been quietly grazing, began to whinny softly, almost as if they were greeting someone important. Onyx paused, raising his head and letting out a commanding neigh that echoed across the fields. It was as though he was announcing his presence, declaring that he was here for a purpose. Graham took a step closer and rested a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "I told you he was special. Now the whole world will know." Caleb simply nodded, watching as Onyx disappeared into the stable. Despite the ache of letting him go, Caleb knew this was the start of something new, not just for Onyx, but for himself, and perhaps even for the world. Days passed at Onyx's new home, and his presence began to leave its mark across the estate. Workers spoke about him as if he were a living legend. Visitors came asking to see him, and Graham, no matter how busy he was, made a point to spend a few moments each day with the horse. One particular morning, Graham strolled alone to the stable. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting the fields in a soft golden glow, and the air carried the tranquil freshness of early dawn. Onyx was trotting lightly in the paddock, but stopped as soon as he spotted Graham. He raised his head, his dark eyes gleaming with recognition as Graham approached the fence. "You seem to be settling in just fine," Graham said, leaning casually against the fence. His voice was softer than usual, almost as if he were speaking to an old friend. Onyx relaxed and Graham smiled, reaching into his pocket to retrieve a piece of apple. Holding out his hand, he offered it to the horse, who accepted the treat gracefully. For a few moments, silence enveloped them, broken only by the gentle sounds of nature around them. "Never thought I'd say this," Graham began, his voice quieter, reflective. "But you've taught me something that years in the business world never could. You've shown me that sometimes the answers aren't found in logic or calculations, but in something much bigger, something we can only feel." Onyx stood motionless, his eyes locked on Graham's, a silent understanding passing between them. There was something profound in the connection between the man and the horse, something that went beyond words. It was mutual respect, gratitude, and the shared discovery of a purpose greater than themselves. Leaning lightly on the fence, Graham continued, "You didn't just save our lives that day. You reminded me that there are things money can't buy: heart, instinct, maybe even destiny." Onyx let out a soft, reassuring whinny. Graham stepped back slightly, looking at the majestic animal before him. "The world will know who you are," he said with conviction. "Not for vanity, but because your story deserves to be told. What you've done is rare, and it won't be forgotten." The moment was tranquil, yet charged with meaning, a rare mix of peace and resolve. Graham felt a determination to honor the creature standing before him, not as an animal, but as a partner, a true friend. That night, the property was cloaked in calm, the stars scattered across the sky like a sprawling quilt of light. The lake nearby mirrored the celestial display, its surface undisturbed. Most of the staff had retired for the evening, leaving only the whispers of the wind and the occasional rustling of leaves to break the silence. In the stables, Onyx rested in his spacious stall, his body still but his eyes alert, as if sensing the world around him never fully slept. It was rare for him to relax completely, as though a part of him always remained vigilant, waiting for a call to action. Suddenly, a faint noise cut through the quiet. It was subtle, but sharp enough to catch Onyx's attention. His head lifted swiftly, ears twitching to locate the source. Outside, a shadow moved along the perimeter of the property, near the tall wooden fence. The figure was cloaked, their movements deliberate and stealthy, betraying a clear intent. Onyx rose to his feet, his stance tense and ready. Recognizing the threat, he released a powerful neigh that echoed through the property. The sound roused the dogs patrolling the grounds, who barked in unison, their calls carrying urgency. Lights flickered on in the main house, and Graham, jolted awake by the commotion, threw on a jacket and stepped onto the porch. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice firm as he addressed one of the security guards, sprinting toward the fence. Onyx was already ahead of them, his hooves striking the earth with deliberate force as he charged toward the disturbance. The stallion stopped abruptly near the source of the noise, planting himself firmly as if daring the intruder to reveal themselves. The guards, armed and alert, followed closely, their flashlights sweeping through the trees. Near the fence, one of them shouted, pointing to movement among the shadows. Graham arrived moments later, his expression a blend of concern and sharp curiosity. As the group approached, they found a man attempting to scale the fence. His desperation was palpable, the small backpack slung over his shoulders bouncing with each awkward movement. Surrounded, the man froze, raising his hands in surrender. "Who are you?" Graham demanded, his tone leaving no room for evasion. The man hesitated, his trembling hands betraying his fear. One of the guards rifled through the intruder's bag, revealing cutting tools and devices clearly intended for sabotage, perhaps to tamper with the property's electrical systems. Graham narrowed his eyes. "You work for whoever tried to destroy us before, don't you?" His question carried the weight of a statement, daring the man to deny it. Finally, the intruder stammered, I was just following orders. I'm not the one in charge." Graham drew a measured breath, his anger restrained, but unmistakable. Turning to Onyx, who stood nearby, unwavering, Graham said with quiet admiration, "Once again, you've protected us." His hand found the horse's muscular neck, offering a firm pat. "You sensed danger before anyone else. You're more than a guardian. You're what this world needs, even if it doesn't realize it yet." Onyx dipped his head slightly, as though accepting the title bestowed upon him. That night, as tranquility slowly returned to the property, Graham knew with certainty that their bond was no mere coincidence. It was destiny, a partnership just beginning to reveal its true purpose. The next evening, the golden glow of the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink. Onyx stood alone atop a grassy hill, his silhouette striking against the vibrant horizon. Caleb, ever watchful and devoted, noticed the horse's contemplative stance from a distance. Curiosity nudged him forward, and he approached slowly, careful not to disturb whatever moment Onyx seemed to be experiencing. "You're always watching the sky, aren't you, boy?" Caleb said softly as he reached his side. Onyx remained still, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the visible. It was as if he saw things no one else could, a guardian, forever scanning the horizon for what lay ahead. Caleb gazed in the same direction as Onyx, but all he could see was the endless sky, scattered with a few wispy clouds. "It's almost like you're waiting for something," Caleb said softly, brushing his hand gently through Onyx's mane. "Do you miss the ranch? Or maybe you see things we can't." Suddenly, the distant hum of an airplane cut through the quiet. Caleb noticed Onyx tense, his ears twitching as though he were catching subtle nuances in the sound. The horse took a measured step forward, his eyes locked on the horizon where the noise originated. Caleb spun around, trying to make sense of what Onyx had sensed. In the sky above, a small airplane moved steadily, seeming harmless at first glance. But Onyx began to trot, heading down the hill toward the open field, as though compelled by an unseen force. Caleb broke into a run, struggling to keep up. "Hey, Onyx, hold up! What are you doing?" Caleb shouted, his voice tinged with both frustration and worry. The horse moved with purpose, pausing abruptly in the middle of the field before rearing back on his hind legs, releasing a loud neigh. His head turned sharply toward the main house, where Graham stood on the patio, deep in conversation with a group of men. Graham noticed Onyx's unusual behavior and furrowed his brow. "What's going on now?" he murmured to himself, before excusing himself from his guests and heading toward the field, the group trailing behind out of curiosity. As Graham approached, he saw Onyx still fixated on the sky, his attention unwavering even as the plane disappeared beyond the horizon. "Caleb!" Graham began, his eyes narrowing as he studied the horse. "What's happening?" "I don't know, sir," Caleb replied, breathless from the chase. "But he's restless again. He never acts like this without a reason." Graham glanced briefly at his guests, offering a polite apology, then moved closer to Onyx. The horse turned to meet Graham's gaze, his dark eyes gleaming with an urgency that sent a chill through the man. "Do you know something? Is that it?" Graham muttered, more to himself than to the animal. One of the men in Graham's group, a retired pilot, looked up at the sky with a deepening frown. "Mr. Kensington," the man said, his voice grave. "That plane, it was flying way too low for its altitude." Graham froze for a moment, his mind racing through possibilities. He looked back at Onyx, who let out a low, almost pleading whinny, his posture tense as though issuing a warning. Graham knew he couldn't ignore it. "Call the control tower," Graham ordered one of his aides. "I want to know everything about that flight." As the men rushed to follow his instructions, Graham remained beside Onyx, his hand steady on the horse's neck. "You've proven before that you see what we don't," Graham said, his voice carrying an unusual reverence. "And I'm trusting you again." A gust of wind swept through the property, rattling the nearby trees as Onyx stood as still as a statue. The air seemed charged, heavy with an unspoken tension. Everyone there felt it. It was the kind of unease that couldn't be ignored. Night fell, but Graham's estate was far from quiet. Phones rang incessantly, messages were exchanged in hurried tones, and the security team remained on high alert. Graham, his face etched with determination, strode toward the stables where Onyx rested. The horse appeared calm now, but Graham knew better than to assume it was mere coincidence. He was about to uncover the truth. "Mr. Iron Kensington," an assistant called out, jogging toward him. "The control tower confirmed your suspicions. That plane was flying below safe altitude. And more than that, the crew reported an unexpected technical failure and had to make an emergency landing." Graham stopped in his tracks, processing the news. He turned to Onyx, who raised his head as though aware he was the subject of discussion. "Is everyone okay?" Graham asked, his voice steady but heavy. "Yes, sir. They landed in time," the assistant confirmed. "But the pilot mentioned something strange. He said he started noticing the issue only minutes after takeoff, like he had some kind of warning." Graham chuckled softly, not in disbelief, but in admiration. Stepping into the stable, he approached Onyx and ran a hand along the horse's mane. "You know this isn't a coincidence, don't you?" Graham said, his voice a mix of awe and gratitude. "I don't know how you do it, Onyx, but it's clear there's something about you that defies explanation." As Graham spoke, Caleb entered the stable, carrying a bucket of fresh water. "Mr. Kensington," Caleb began, offering a tired but proud smile. "Looks like he's done it again, hasn't he?" "Yes, Caleb," Graham replied, never taking his eyes off Onyx. "And I have no doubt it won't be the last time." Caleb set the bucket down and gently patted Onyx's neck. "You know," he said quietly, "I think the world needs more stories like this. More hope. Onyx is proof that there are forces out there looking out for us, even when we don't understand how." Graham nodded slowly. "You're right. And that's why I'll make sure this story gets told. Not just to inspire, but to remind people that courage, instinct, and maybe even destiny play a bigger role in our lives than we realize." As we wrap up this incredible story, I want to take a moment to reflect on the lessons it offers. While Onyx's journey isn't based on real events, it carries profound truths about courage, instinct, and the unseen connections that bind us all. Onyx, with his unyielding bravery and unspoken wisdom, reminds us that sometimes the heroes we need aren't who or what we expect. His actions demonstrate that listening to our instincts and trusting the bonds we share with others can lead us to incredible outcomes, even in the face of danger. This story also speaks to the power of gratitude and responsibility. Caleb's unwavering care for Onyx and Graham's decision to honor the horse's heroism both show us the importance of recognizing and nurturing the greatness in those around us, whether human or animal. But now, I want to hear from you. What did this story mean to you? Did it spark a new perspective, or remind you of a time when instinct or unexpected courage played a role in your life? Let's talk about it in the comments. I can't wait to hear your thoughts, because stories like this aren't just for us to enjoy, they're meant to inspire meaningful conversations.